For over 30 years, 10 bodies, 3 initials which struck terror in the heartlands of America.
B stands for bind, T stands for torture, and K stands for kill. Bind, torture, kill.
A serial killer so deadly, even the police feared where he would strike next.
I was terrified that this guy was maybe going to come after my family.
We go inside police files, piece together the forensic evidence, and reveal the true story of the hunt for one of the world's most wanted.
Hands up! Out of the car now!
Wichita, Kansas, built on the prairie flats of the Midwest. Honest, God-fearing, middle America. The biggest city in the state they call the Buckle on the Bible Belt. A community where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, until a serial killer began to prowl the streets. For over 30 years, 2 generations of detectives hunted Wichita's serial killer. Lieutenant Landwehr headed the BTK task force.
We knew sooner or later he will kill again if we fail in our attempt.
BTK first struck in 1974. What detectives found at the scene haunted former Chief of Police Richard LeMunyon for decades.
This is the house where it all started. This is where BTK made his first hit over 30 years ago. Most of our homicides were the domestic type, the smoking gun, bar fights, things of that nature. But this particular one was highly unusual, took all of us by surprise.
The wood frame house was home to the Otero family, who had only just moved into the area. Joseph was an Air Force veteran, and his wife Julie worked in the local factory.
It was very shocking for the officers when they came up. They found the parents face down in their own bedroom, fully clothed, obviously strangled, bags over their head.
The strangled corpse of 9-year-old Joe Jr. was in another bedroom. But police were still to make another horrific discovery. His 11-year-old sister, Josephine.
Josephine had been put through a different type of death than the others. He took her downstairs, and she was obviously alive. He had put a rope around her neck and over some pipes, and he would raise her up, and as she was dying, and he was masturbating at that time, so she was the target, the primary target, I believe, for this.
The other 3 Otero children had only escaped because they were at school when the killer attacked. The killer had made certain there was no call for help, disabling the phone line before entering the house.
That's what led the investigators to thinking that this couldn't be a random thing. People just don't walk in off the street and murder a family. You couldn't get your mind around that. That didn't happen in Wichita, Kansas.
But Wichita was different now. BTK had arrived. January 1974. The Wichita Police Department was searching for the brutal murderer of the Otero family. The victims, a mother, father, and 2 of their children. All 4 had been asphyxiated and strangled.
Why would someone do this to a family? No one would do this just to go in and do it. There had to be a reason for it.
Police thought there could be a sexual motive due to evidence left at the scene.
They were focusing on seminal fluid that was deposited near the body of Josephine Otero. They were primarily interested in determining the blood group if possible.
Blood typing suggested the killer was blood type O, but that's the commonest type. 40% of people are type O. Before the use of DNA, the test could only narrow down the suspect list so far. For 9 months, police followed up every lead they had. Witnesses provided descriptions and identikits were drawn up. Then, in October 1974, 3 men confessed to murdering the Oteros. But one person knew they were lying.
Those 3 dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity for the Otero murders. They know nothing at all. I did it by myself, and with no one's help.
Only the letter's author knew the horrific details.
Josephine, hanging by the neck in the northwest part of the basement. Hands tied with bind cord, feet with clothesline cord. Her glasses in the southwest bedroom.
Only the killer would know. None of this had been released publicly.
FBI profiler Roy Hazelwood has analyzed BTK's behavior.
It is unusual for a serial killer to correspond following the commission of a crime. BTK certainly suffered from malignant narcissism. And that's when you begin to consider yourself superior to others, that you're incapable of making mistakes, and you have a desperate need for attention.
He had typed this letter, took it to the city library, and then he called one of the local newspaper reporters.
BTK craved attention and used his letter to taunt the police. He dared them to catch him before he struck again.
When this monster enters my brain, I will never know. Maybe you can stop him. I can't. He has already chosen his next victim. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. B-T-K. They will be on the next victim.
He's a psychopath, and a psychopath is a very manipulative individual. He's an individual who manages to compartmentalize. In other words, he can separate out what's taking place from his involvement.
Then nothing for 3 years. But BTK was preparing to strike again. His next victim lived here on Hydraulic Street.
She was a mother, alone with her children, and she was ill that day.
24-year-old Shirley Vian was at home with her 3 children that day.
He had what he called a hit kit. He brought his own materials.
Rope and duct tape to bind the victim, and a gun to force them into submission. At 11:45 a.m., he was ready to strike.
Get in the bedroom! Get in the bedroom! Get in the bedroom! Get in the bedroom! Get in the bedroom!
He locked the children in the bathroom. He murdered her by strangling her, slowly.
Sexual sadism feeds off of the response to the infliction of physical or emotional pain. It's extremely important for BTK to elicit that response of terror and fear.
Then something happened. He didn't get the phone wire cut, So the phone rang, but it became a panic situation for him. So he left. The investigators came to me and said there's a possibility this is tied to the Otero murders.
Something else puzzled the chief. Shirley Vian's son saw the murderer at the door of a neighbor's home earlier in the same day.
We never did think that she was the primary target, which turns out she wasn't.
Very few people experience in a lifetime being able to say, I was the target of a serial killer, because most people that are targets of serial killers don't live to talk about it.
Cheryl Sarkozy and Judy Skirl were roommates back in the late 70s, living just a few doors down from Shirley Vian. But on the day of the murder, the women were out.
I came home and the police said that a man had murdered the woman down the street from me, but previous to him murdering her, he had come to my house and knocked on my door. So the police believed that I was the intended victim that day.
Cheryl had had a lucky escape, but the roommates think BTK came back the following year.
And I can remember turning on the kitchen light as I'm entering the room, and I looked up and I saw a man peeking in the back window. And he turned and walked away. And by then we had the phone and we had dove underneath the kitchen table for safety. And tried to call the police and waited underneath the kitchen table until the sun came up.
BTK targeted neighborhoods where he thought he might find women at home, alone.
He would troll the area. He would find somebody that looked right to him, and that's how he would target his victims.
25-year-old Nancy Fox lived alone, getting home late from working 2 jobs.
Part of his protection against making mistakes was getting to know his victims, gathering intelligence, where they live, what kind of car they drive, what time they come home.
On the 8th of December, 1977, Nancy Fox returned home from her job at a jewelry store.
Hi, Nancy.
Manual and ligature strangulation, hanging, these are very slow and agonizing ways to die.
Sure. Tight through here.
He did take the victims to the brink of death, let them know that they were at the point of death, and that he had allowed them to come back.
Tie a little bit tighter.
That method of allowing the victim to revive goes to his playing the role of God. He has within his power life and death over another human being.
8:18 the following morning, police hear the killer's voice for the first time.
Dispatcher? You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing. Nancy Fox. I'm sorry, sir.
Goes to his narcissism, that need for attention. Here I am, I'm calling you to let you know that I did it, and you still can't catch me.
South Pershing. Nancy Fox.
Police rushed to the call box, but when they got there, the killer was gone.
It's part of his power, it's part of his game that he's playing with the police.
2 months later, BTK made his next move. A package arrived at this Wichita TV station.
It was a package that contained not only a letter, but a poem, and I have a portion of the poem here. It was titled, "Oh, Death to Nancy. What is this that I see? Cold, icy hands taking hold of me. For death has come, you all can see. Hell has opened up its gate to trick me." And then it's signed BTK. He said, quote, "How about some names for me? Well, I like the following. Some names like the BTK Strangler, the Psycho." And then he continues, he says,
"The Wichita Executioner, the Asphyxiator,
The killer claimed to have committed 7 murders: the Otero family, Shirley Vianne, Nancy Fox, and one unnamed victim.
How many do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention? I think it's this line that absolutely stopped everyone in their tracks.
BTK's threat to kill again gave police a horrible dilemma: give the killer the recognition he craved, or risk provoking him into another kill.
There was a lot of debate in terms of what we should do. Should we give him credit? Should we not give him credit?
There's certainly a danger of recognizing the presence of a serial killer within the community, and particularly giving him a name, because now what you've done is you've validated what he's doing. It may, in fact, encourage him to commit more murders.
But with us right now is Chief of Police Richard Lemunion.
But police decided they had to warn the public. A serial killer was stalking Wichita.
Do you see any pattern to BTK's conduct?
We have an individual who apparently has the uncontrollable desire to kill at times.
Ultimately, I was the one who had to make the decision. Yes, you're smarter than we are. Yes, we recognize who you are, and yes, this is your name. We were convinced that unless we were able to get him communicating, we would have another murder.
Chief, what kind of leads do you have?
Well, very honestly, we have no solid leads at all.
Using TV, the chief tried to snare BTK with a strange experiment: subliminal imaging.
The subliminal image was 1 or 2 frames that was spliced into videotape, and in it, it contained a couple of words. And what the psychological impact of that, we hoped, was that that image would be burned into BTK's brain. It sounds rather silly now, but 30 years ago, there was some credence to that.
Here's what went out on air.
Bright murder that occurred.
Here it is, slowed 50 times.
In the Nancy Fox sketch that he sent us was a pair of glasses that was lying upside down. And so what the behavioral science people came up with was a picture with a pair of glasses upside down, and it simply said, "Call the chief," knowing that he was watching this.
That person is going to kill again.
It didn't work. He never did communicate with me.
Robert Beatty, a local attorney following the BTK story, felt panic grip the entire city.
Women would call the police to come and check their residence. Night after night, they would go in the house with their guns drawn and flashlight out, searching through the house.
People were scared to death that this maniac was going to get them, particularly young women.
I put triple locks on all my exterior doors. I put interior locks on our bedroom doors. And even still, I just laid awake all night waiting for this man to come back.
We came to the conclusion that this was someone that lived in this community, that was someone's neighbor. We think he's one of us, and that's why we can't find him. He's right out here among us.
How could detectives uncover the killer in their community? New forensic tests were used to examine clothing from the Nancy Fox crime scene.
The robe that was submitted from the Nancy Fox scene was processed. Once we've identified stains that are possibly semen, we can use a microscope to look for sperm cells.
Scientists could now classify people into 2 categories: secretors or non-secretors.
If you're examining a seminal fluid stain and you're unable to identify a blood group, one conclusion that you could draw is that person is a non-secretor.
BTK's blood type was not detectable in his semen. This made him a non-secretor. This new information made the previous blood typing inconclusive. To narrow down the suspects, the lab carried out a further test on proteins present in the semen, called PGM.
The perpetrator was a non-secretor. That narrows it down to approximately 20% of the population. And if, on the other hand, you also know that they are a PGM type 1, and that is expressed by 50% of the population, you can combine these two points of information and further narrow it down to about 10% of the population.
But even with this information, BTK could still be one of more than 15,000 men in Wichita alone. What made it even harder for police was that BTK left long gaps between murders. It had been 3 years since his last killings.
Every time he makes a mistake, you'll see a period where he will not take any action at all. After he makes his phone call in the Fox case, his voice is recorded.
Nancy Fox.
He's afraid, again, that someone will be able to identify him.
Following the murder of Nancy Fox, BTK seemed to go underground again.
We know that he was out there selecting victims in preparation for future attacks.
As detectives struggled to picture the phantom stalking their city, BTK was free to kill again. In the 1970s, a killer had brutally murdered 7 people in the city of Wichita, Kansas. He was known as BTK, bind, torture, kill. Police searched for a pattern in BTK's killings, or links between the victims. They fell within a small radius, but nothing else appeared to link them.
It'd be impossible to gauge who his next victim would be. He is totally random, and that would be very difficult for any investigator to try to link those together because it just depends on what he feels like that day.
Police looked again at the evidence in the hope of finding a connection with the killer. The letters sent by BTK were always photocopied to help disguise the typewriter he had used. But unknown to BTK, early photocopiers used distinctive paper rolls and toner. Detectives traced the paper from BTK's communications to a machine in this building on the campus of the State University. Police hoped this might pinpoint BTK, but he was not the only one using this machine.
The problem is it was public access. Anybody could put a nickel in, and anybody could make a copy there.
The photocopier could not reveal BTK's identity.
The best evidence we had was the voice tape. We played it over and over again.
I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you. What is the address? 843 South Pershing.
The voice on the recording that came into the dispatcher appeared to be a white male. So we're looking at white males, probably in their age of their 40s.
That is correct.
But then, in the 1980s, BTK disappeared again. There were no more letters, and the murders seemed to stop. Had he given up, or was he stalking his next victim?
We were told all along, serial killers can't stop. You know, we didn't believe that. We believe he did stop. We believe he was here.
Police set up a special task force to keep up the hunt for BTK.
They had looked at every eccentric, everybody with a sexual offender record, everybody basically with a criminal record. They had looked at them and excluded them.
Then in 1985, after 6 years of silence, another body was discovered. 53-year-old Maureen Hedge was found in a ditch on the outskirts of Wichita. She had been strangled. But police could not be sure if this was BTK. He had never moved a victim from their home before.
He knows that that's going to delay the investigation, that it's going to be worked as a missing person, that she drove away. He didn't want to arouse any suspicions.
The murder didn't fit with the killer's normal pattern.
There was a discernible ritual, not a discernible MO. Let's define MO. MO are those acts necessary to the commission of the crime. The thing that makes BTK discernible is his ritual.
The killer took the body of Mrs. Hedge into an empty church that night to take a series of sexually explicit photographs.
But he took her there as a challenge, if you will. He went to God's home, God's house on earth, and desecrated it as part of his belief of how powerful he is.
Despite the bold risks the killer took, the murder of Maureen Hedge remained unsolved.
So they can take these greater risks with the confidence that they are so superior, they're not going to be caught.
BTK meticulously planned his attacks. He could wait years to find the right victim. In between attacks, jewelry stolen from previous victims became the focus of BTK's attention.
I think he had his trophies. He could relive the crime. There are ways for a person to satisfy himself, and that's masturbatory fantasies. So we know he used his trophies.
6 years after the murder of Maureen Hedge, another body was found. 62-year-old Dolores Davis was enjoying her retirement in a house on the outskirts of town. As Mrs. Davis slept, someone hurled a concrete block through the glass door of her home.
Sounded like a bomb, probably. And I think she jumped out of bed, and, you know, you're trying to get your bearings, figure out what went on, and here's this animal standing there, and then he went ahead and strangled her with her pantyhose.
Police discovered the body under this bridge, 10 miles north of Wichita. But they didn't know just how close the killer was. BTK had set up a complex alibi to ensure he would not become a suspect.
It was about 1.5 miles away from his house. He had set up that he was on a scouting trip because it was close to his house, so he thought it was too close to home that he thought that he might become a suspect.
He left no evidence. There were no witnesses. If you have a 10 as the maximum, best organized, then I would say, with 1 being the least organized, then I would say BTK's an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10.
786 Roger. 1 David 109.
Over 30 years after BTK had first struck, 10 unsolved murders still haunted the city. In his letter of 1978, the killer had claimed 7 attacks. But BTK had remained silent on 3 more unsolved murders. All leads had come to a dead end. But in 2004, advances in DNA technology provided a breakthrough that would prove crucial. The semen samples from murders BTK carried out in the 1970s were reanalyzed. Police now had a DNA profile of the killer.
We had the DNA profile of BTK. However, until we had a profile from a known individual that we can compare that to, we couldn't identify that individual. The only thing that we could exclude is that when we ran the profile through the DNA database, this person was not a convicted offender that had his profile in the database.
Then, on the 30th anniversary of BTK's first attack, came news of an upcoming book saying that BTK was history.
I thought, this guy is probably dead. But started as an academic educational exercise. But there was a point when I realized that this might actually flesh out the killer. If he is still out there, we may hear from him.
That was a challenge to BTK. I'm still here. You know, I'm still omnipresent, if you will. I'm everywhere.
March 19th, 2004. A letter arrived here claiming credit for a brutal, unsolved murder in 1986. The victim, 28-year-old Vicky Wegerle. The signature was all too familiar.
There was no doubt that it was a genuine communication. We were going to work the case that it was BTK and that we were going to catch him this time. The strategy was to keep him talking, because the problem we'd had before was that we'd get a letter from him and then we would not hear from him for another 3 or 4 years. So we wanted the frequency of the communications to increase.
Police could not risk BTK going underground again.
And it was critical that we set up a bond between Lieutenant Landwehr and this killer. At this point, the FBI told us that it was very possible that the killer could become obsessed with that person and possibly target them or their family.
This was the worst time of my life. I was terrified that this guy was maybe going to come after my family or somebody, or kill someone else in this community, and it was going to be on my watch.
We were very, very careful to never say anything that might challenge him, anything that he might perceive as belittling. We did not want to set this man off. We did not want to upset him in any way.
This is one of the most challenging cases that I've ever been involved with. And I find that the individual that is doing this would be very interesting to talk to.
I'm not talking to the press. I'm not talking to the public. I'm talking to BTK. And I want BTK to understand that he finally got the notoriety that he had always craved.
The residents of Wichita felt the fear of over 30 years ago grip the city again. The hunt was on for BTK. BTK responded to Lieutenant Landwehr's appeals in a series of notes and packages, often inside cereal boxes marked BTK. He sent a bound and hung doll, a chilling reference to young Josephine Otero. But even more sinister, BTK revealed his plans to kill again.
I've spotted a female that I think lives alone. Just got to work out the details. I'm much older now, and I have to condition myself carefully. Got to do it this year or next. Time is running out for me.
He makes a threat that he has found someone, and we made sure that the public knew. This is serious. Don't trust anybody.
I could see the fear in their eyes. And when the most important people in an investigation are that scared, it's a scary feeling for everyone.
For 10 months, police play a game of cat and mouse with BTK, until the killer's urge to communicate leads to a critical mistake. He leaves a package in an open flatbed truck outside a Wichita hardware store, in a parking lot covered by security cameras. Detectives prepared to analyze more than 2,000 hours of footage in a race against time.
A vehicle comes into the lot, it does kind of a loop, and it pulls next to the truck. He pulls something out from his vehicle and places it behind the cab of the truck, and then gets back in his vehicle and pulls away.
The pictures wouldn't identify BTK, but could they pinpoint his vehicle? Forensic experts analyzed the image. By measuring the size, volume, and ground clearance, as well as the paintwork shade of the vehicle, detectives made a crucial discovery. BTK drove a black Jeep Cherokee. In the message left at the hardware store, the killer asks if a computer floppy disk can be traced back to the computer which authored it. If police promised it couldn't, he'd send future messages that way.
He felt himself in such a powerful position, and the police were so dependent upon him for information that they couldn't possibly lie to him.
But police weren't playing by BTK's rules. They set a trap using a newspaper advert.
He wants us to answer in code. He says, "Rex, it will be okay." The chances of him falling for that, we didn't think that was a possibility. I don't think anyone could ever believe that we were that lucky.
BTK had made a fatal error. The disk he sent was rushed to the forensics team. Could such a simple trap have finally snared BTK?
Microsoft embeds in many of its documents something called metadata. And that metadata is information about the file. You can access that by going to File, Properties. And as you can see here, the software that was registered to Christ Lutheran Church.
This church is just north of Wichita. But how could it possibly be linked to a serial killer?
In addition to that, we can see that the document was last saved by a person named Dennis.
After 31 years, a name. What happened next was so quick, so simple. It's hard to believe.
We came up with a website for Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. And on that home page, there's a link to people who are related to the church. So when we click on that link, it brings up the page that has president of the congregation was Dennis Rader.
Detectives rushed to Dennis Rader's house. They still had to check out one vital detail.
As we came down the street here, we saw that there was a black Jeep Cherokee in the driveway. And it was just a huge rush of energy because the thing about the Cherokee was it was the one piece of evidence that he didn't know we had.
Even with the Jeep, the evidence was circumstantial. Lieutenant Landwehr ordered detectives to hold off.
As lieutenant, I bring them all back. I say, no. I wanted to be sure, and I wanted to get some DNA.
Police needed to link Dennis Rader's DNA with that of the killer. By secretly accessing medical records, they obtained the DNA profile of Rader's daughter.
They wanted to establish if BTK was in fact the father of this individual. It's fair to say that you could exclude over 99% of the population with these paternity tests.
DNA from the crime scenes and Rader's daughter proved BTK and Dennis Rader were the same man. Armed with this data, police were poised to strike. Shortly after 12 noon on February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader headed home for lunch.
Out of the car! Get your hands up! Hands up! Out of the car now! Move! Go! Keep them in the air! Let's go! Dennis Rader, you're under arrest.
It was kind of fun, to be honest with you. Every police officer since 1974 has wished for the day that I got right there. It was a great feeling of relief. Great feeling. I can't remember a better feeling in my life.
The bottom line, BTK is arrested.
The pall of fear hanging over Wichita had lifted. BTK was captured. But just how much would he reveal? At BTK's trial, chilling details of 30 years of killing would shock the nation. The serial killer who stalked Wichita, Kansas for over 30 years had been unmasked as Dennis Rader. But what would he reveal to the police?
Dennis Rader, you're under arrest.
I know, so basically...
This is the actual footage of Rader's 30-hour interrogation. At first, he stonewalled. Then 3 hours in, Lieutenant Landwehr played his ace, the DNA.
I know that BTK is the father of your children. Of your children. I know that. No doubt. It's a done deal. The tests were done.
Say who you are. Why don't you just say it? You're BTK.
Okay. The strategy of winning Rader's trust had been a spectacular success.
He honestly believes that, you know, he's the fox and we're the hounds. I mean, I'm serious. He thinks that we're going to come after him, and that's part of the chase, and he's going to escape, and then we're going to come after him again. And now that we've caught him, we're all good buddies.
On 27th of June, 2005, Dennis Rader began the most chilling courtroom confession. ever heard, as he coldly revealed secrets he'd kept for over 30 years.
First degree in count 2, a Class A felony.
How he killed the Otero family in 1974.
First of all, Mr. Otero was strangled, or a bag put over his head and strangled. Then I thought he was going down, and I went over and strangled Mrs. Otero, and I thought she was down. Then I strangled Junior, and then when I went back, Josephine had woke back up.
What did you do then?
And I took her to the basement and eventually hung her.
All right, you hung her in the basement?
Yes, sir.
All right, did you do anything else at that time?
Yes, I had some sexual fantasies, but that was after she was hung.
One of the problems that the public has in dealing with serial offenders is they can't quite get over the fact that almost invariably they look like us. And we don't want our perverts to look like us.
This mask of normality was BTK's disguise. He was a family man with a wife and 2 kids. But this dad was a little different. By the time he had 2 children, he'd tortured 7 people to death.
This was the one part of his life that signified the amount of power that he had. He craved power.
BTK's wife, Paula, sang in the church choir. He helped run the Boy Scouts. He'd chosen the ideal job for a murderer, touring Wichita, installing locks and security alarms in people's houses.
He's chameleon-like. He can project different things to different people.
When they talk about how his wife had to have known, and I thought, well, you know, I worked with this guy 8 hours a day. I was around him maybe as much as his family. No, you never. If I ever had to walk down a dark alley, I would have said, I want Dennis. He's the guy I want to be with.
Working in any form or fashion.
But there was another side to Dennis Rader.
If you read much about serial killers, they go through what they call the trolling stage. Basically, you're looking for a victim at that time. And that you could be trolling for months or years. But once you lock in on a certain person, then you become stalking. And that might be several of them, but you really home in on that person.
He called the killing of Nancy Fox his most satisfying crime.
I confronted her, told her there I was I had a problem, sexual problem, that I would have to tie her up and have sex with her. A
little bit of light bondage. And
she was a little upset. I took the belt and then strangled her with the belt at that time.
In Rader's shocking confession, he admitted to 10 killings since his first attack way back in 1974. The police had been sure of 7 murders, but a further 3 victims were added to BTK's final death toll. One mystery remained. Why had there been such long gaps between the murders?
Basically, he was raising his children. And once his children were born, it limited the time that he could be away from home. And he did not want his wife to become suspicious.
When he was unable to kill, Rader satisfied his urges by practicing on himself.
Ties himself up and takes photographs. That's what's important, is the bondage and the imagery. He had a fantasy that all of the victims that died would serve him in the afterlife.
Those who knew Rader couldn't believe what they were hearing.
When he went on to talk about the details and how he, smothered, put bags over those kids' head, and I don't know, it's just, it's very bizarre.
Rader escaped execution only because his murders were committed before Kansas voted to restore the death penalty.
I hate him. The greatest satisfaction I have in my life is the thought of him burning in hell. When you think about what that cockroach did to so many lives, can you ever exact enough punishment, enough pain to make up for that? No.
His sentence was the toughest the judge could impose. Consecutive life sentences, totaling 175 years.
There will be people who will study Dennis Rader, I am sure, and try to figure out what makes him tick. I don't really care what makes Dennis Rader tick. The only thing that I'm concerned about is that Dennis Rader will no longer hurt anyone else. And I will sleep very nicely, just knowing that he's where he belongs.